So this lesson we're going to be covering how to create a start and a stop button. So start button starts the interval counter, and that's going to be counting every millisecond. End stops the interval, and then start once again starts the counter from where it last left off. So it's going to be adding the two buttons to the page, adding the output area to the page, and using the set interval and clear interval to control the counter functionality. Let's go ahead and use the set interval. So I've got one page element with a class of main. We're going to select that within the JavaScript, linking to a JavaScript file called app.js. So for main, we're going to select it as an object. Let's make a selection of the element with a class of main using the document query selector, and selecting the element with a class of main. So that's using the dot for selecting the class. So it's going to make a selection of the element object. We'll also set up a value that we're going to be starting out at 0, and then we're going to be incrementing this value. And now we want to create a function that we can use. This is the callback function for the interval, and I'm going to call it counter. So it'll take in a parameter for one value of a, and within the console log, for now, we'll just output whatever we currently have for the value of a. So next, what we want to set up the interval. So what the interval does is it provides a way to execute a code snippet repeatedly. So this is the code snippet that we're going to be repeatedly executing, and we want to set the time delay interval. So using the set interval method, we set up the function that we want to call. So it's going to be the block of code that we want to call. And we also want to select the number of milliseconds that we want the code to be executed in. So the delay for the number of milliseconds, it will default to 0 if there's no value specified. And I'm going to set it at 1000 milliseconds. So that's going to run this code interval of every second. We do have an option to pass arguments in. So these are going to be values. So if we want to increase the value of val by 1 or by 5, we can pass that in as an argument. So that's going to be retrieved within the counter function under a, and then that's what we can output. So how about we take the value of val and we increment it by whatever we've got the value of a, and then within the console for now, we'll output the value of val. So that's going to be incrementing by 5 as it's going up. And then what we want it to do is we want to overwrite the content within main. So instead of having to use the console, we're going to output it into the main area. So selecting the main text content and updating whatever we've got for the value there as the value of val. So it's going to increment by whatever number we've set. Now the arguments within the function are completely optional. So you don't need to include any arguments within this function. So you can also leave these out. And it's not going to be. There's also a way to identify the interval as an object, and that gives us an opportunity to clear the interval. So let's set up a variable for the interval, and we're going to assign the set interval to an object called int_val. So that's going to be where we can access the interval object. And instead of writing to main, I'm going to create some page elements. So I'll create some buttons. So one button to start and another button to stop the functionality. So using the document create element, creating an element. So that one can be a button, and then create a second page element button, and then add both of those to the page. So using main append, add the button 1, and then also add the button 2. And button 1 we can set to start. So button 1 will have text content that will say start, and button 2 will have text content and set that to say end. So we want to start the interval, and then we want to stop the interval, and we also want to create a place to output some content. So this is where we can output the counter, and this is also going to be a new element. So using create element, and the element that we're going to be creating will be a div. And then we're going to add that into the main as well. So select main and append the element with the output object. And if you want to put it in front of the buttons, then you can do this way, or you could do a prepend. So that gives us the two buttons, and we want to set the buttons. So with button 1, let's add a click event. So this click event is going to start the event object, and then the button 2 on click will end the interval counter. So it should stop the counter. So we're setting the counter as interval. We want to set up a global variable that we can use for the interval. And then when we want to launch it, we assign the value to the interval value and launch the counter every 5 or every 1000 milliseconds. Update this to output into the output text content, whatever we want for the value of val. Set the value of val to be 0, so these are going to be our two global variables. And then using the clear interval, clear the interval for the counter when we press end. So let's go ahead and we're going to try it out when we hit start. So it's starting out and it's not showing it as a number because it's expecting a value passed into the variable. And we could also make this dynamic since we're starting and stopping it. So let's set this up as 1. So we're going to add to it by the value of 1. Pressing end will stop the interval. Pressing start will once again start the interval. So that's how you can make a quick start and stop. If you want it to count a lot quicker, you can get it to count every millisecond with the start and stop functionality. We should also clear the interval from the variable. So we can set the variable and set that to null. And that will avoid the ability to launch multiple intervals. So whenever we click it, we want to be able to stop the interval from happening. So we'll check to see first if the interval exists. And if the interval it does not exist or it's set to null, then we're going to set the interval. Otherwise, we could have multiple intervals and that's going to ruin the functionality where we're able to stop and start it if we have multiple intervals running in the background. So this is a way that you can ensure that you only just have the one interval at the interval value that's set there, and that's also the one that's going to be cleared when we press the button to clear the interval. So go ahead and start it up and create your own version of the counter with the start and stop buttons, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.